Metaphorrefantazio. We all know it. It's the newest Atlus game, the studio behind Persona and SMT. And not just that, but it's Hashino, Studio Zero, the man, the myth, the legend that has directed Persona 3, 4, 5, SMT3 Nocturne, and Catherine. And this is their newest game. It takes elements from their previous titles and it creates a new IP with it. Within a medieval fantasy setting with many different races, tribes, and cultures, the king gets assassinated. Not a spoiler, by the way, the game shows this in a cutscene before you even reach the main menu, and will for some reason show it every single time you boot up the game. But the king gets assassinated, and you, Will Metaphor, that is his real name, yes, sets out on a journey across the continent to participate in a contest to decide the next king. And if you know me, which you probably don't, you might know that I really adore Persona. I really like SMT3 and I love Catherine. So I was very excited for this game and I started writing this script literally a few minutes after beating it. And you know what? While my playthrough definitely had a lot of ups and downs, in the end I do really like this game now that I'm reflecting on it. So I have some notes here and I'm just gonna talk about my experience for a bit. And if you like videos like this but also more structured and long form reviews on JRPGs and the like, be sure to check out my channel or just drop a like and a comment. It really helps me out and I would greatly appreciate that. Metaphor is in many ways a special game, but my playthrough with it did have quite a few ups and downs, and at parts I honestly couldn't even be bothered to play it. The game could really drag on at parts, and I wish that they did more with this as the start of a new IP. I'm gonna get into this point by point though, but keep in mind that while I do have a lot of criticisms in this video, ultimately I really love this game, because Metaphor tells a very special message about the importance of fantasy and fiction. The game is all about how these things have the power to influence reality, how it can give people strength. We all play games here, we all most likely had that experience with a game that just makes you go, man. After you watch the credits and you think about life. We know the impact that this medium can have. Games are art after all, and Metaphor's message is about exactly that. How it can influence your outlook on life, how it can influence your ideals, and even how it can help you overcome anxiety, help you chase your dreams. And it tells you this message in a very poignant way, with many of the characters and story arcs being driven by this. And these characters are awesome, and many of their best moments are also some of the highlights of the narrative for me. Their social links or bonds are kind of hit or miss though. Some of them are fantastic, like Heisme's, but others are just kinda fine, like Hulkenberg's. But it's their role in the main narrative that makes each and every character stand out regardless. Stroll's awakening, for example, was the first time that the game really grabbed my attention. The way that it was portrayed, the incredible voice acting, the music, the explosiveness, it's just a moment that to me really stands out, even now after having beaten the game. Or that moment when everyone showed their devotion for Will, fighting off hordes of humans so he could escape in the end. But it's also not just those loud moments, it's also stuff like seeing Basilio start to question his path over the course of the game, the little exchange between him and Heisme at the end, or just seeing the characters hang out in the final cutscenes. I really like this cast of characters and, kind of unknowingly so, got very attached to them over the course of the game. Which is why many of my examples are literally from the end of the story. I always knew I liked them, but seeing them in those final scenes, a year had passed and just seeing them doing their thing after accomplishing their goal gave me this warm feeling that really cemented this cast of characters in my heart. And even in the supporting cast, you have characters like Maria or some of the other candidates that each had their own spotlights and arcs that were progressing in the background. Take Batlin for example. He was introduced as this random guy who saw an opportunity to narrate the contest, starting off with a bias against us, only for him to slowly switch sides over the course of the story, as Will is showing him with his actions that we're working to create a better world. Kinda giving us a representation for the general public who is watching this contest from a distance. I also really like that Batlin doesn't have a Bond episode. We're just crossing paths during the narrative and we get to know him that way. Not every single character needs a Bond for them to be relevant, bond, and that makes the world a lot more grounded, and the narrative can also be more dynamic because of that. Most of the bonds are pretty good though, now that I'm mentioning them. Some of them started off kind of slow, like Alonso, but his story really surprised me in the end, and I really love how it all ties back to that main narrative theme. I don't really want to go into all of these bonds though, this is supposed to be a quicker video compared to some of my other stuff, but I will mention that there aren't that many of these Bond characters, and I feel like that's a good thing, as there aren't really any bad ones. All of these characters and their stories are decently interesting at the very least. But some of my highlight characters of Bonds that aren't party members would probably be Alonso, Katarina, and Maria. And if we are talking about party members, then my favorites would probably be Basilio, Heisme, Stroll, and Juna. It's kind of hard to pick a top 3 or 4 though, because I do really like all of these characters, but I think those are the ones that stood out the most to me. It is kind of a shame that these Bond episodes aren't voiced though. I get that it's a bit of a weird situation because Persona 3 Reload did have voiced social links, and that game came out before Metaphor. But Metaphor has also been in development for a lot longer, so I fully understand why they aren't voiced in this game. I just wanted to mention it because at times I did find myself thinking like, damn, I really wish these were voiced. That was a bit of a side note though, as there is one character in specific that I do want to give his own little highlight section. Luis, who is probably my favorite Atlus villain. I really like how you don't really know what his deal is until very late in the game. Throughout most of the story, they keep his motives and even his goals very mysterious, but despite all of that, he still manages to steal every single scene he is in, and when they do finally reveal everything near the end game, it makes so much sense, and it's so satisfying to see everything connect back to that main recurring theme. Luis is actually from the Elden tribe, and him posing as a Clamar really shows his knowledge of how this world operates. And because of everything that has happened to him and his tribe in the past, he feels like he needs to fix society through a forced evolution, because that is, according to him, the only way to end the racism between tribes, the only way to reach true equality. He already gave up on this world. He doesn't believe in the same fantasy as the protagonist does, because according to him, fantasy is no more than an empty dream. So how can you make such promises? I love how it all connects back to this as we beat him with our sheer willpower. Our characters overcome their anxieties and they overcome the battle against Luis, knowing that fantasy is a dream with the power to change the world. A beautiful final climax, which only hits as hard as it did because we went on this journey. We have a connection to this cast, and because Luis has been such a prevalent force throughout the game. But even if his reasoning is kept for the late game, as I mentioned, he still manages to steal every single scene that he is in. He is an incredible villain, and the game is so good at building this intrigue around him. And the fact that his voice actor is phenomenal also really helps with this, by the way. All of the voice actors are immaculate, actually. I have no idea how they didn't get a single nomination at the Chef Awards. The performances in Metaphor are honestly some of the best in the medium. And there's one more character that I want to talk about for a little section, the main character, or Will. Because while I like the narrative surrounding him, the game does put him in a bit of a weird spot because he's basically a silent protagonist, but he also has full voice acting for some reason. The plot is very centered around him, and because of that I do understand what they were going for. But I feel like they should have gone further with this and made him an actual character for it to work in full effect. I kinda noticed while recording this video as well, because sometimes I've been referring to him as Will, and other times I refer to him as you, the player. Right now, he just sits kind of awkwardly in the middle of being a self-insert like the other Atlus protagonists, but he's also still his own character. But that aside, I loved this cast, and I loved going on this journey with them, exploring the continent, meeting different tribes, and learning about their different cultures. The game does an incredible job at making you feel like you're on this grand journey, in the same way that I love from my favorite classic JRPGs. I talked about this in my Final Fantasy Fantasy IX review, but I love games that start you off on foot, until you unlock a vehicle, which then later turns into a ship, and at the end you have an aircraft. It's something simple, but it's such a satisfying feeling of progression. The satisfaction here is hindered a little bit though by the fact that it's all accessed through a menu, but that still didn't stop me from having the biggest, dumbest smile on my face when Nuras managed to get this thing to fly. What also really adds to this feeling of being on the journey though is the sightseeing, because on your way to a remote location you would often run into a landmark, which makes the party stop and look out over the horizon. They talk about the scenery a bit, you get some nice artwork, you bring that artwork back to Maria and she hangs it up on the wall in the inn. It's a small touch, but it added so much to this whole experience and this feeling of being on a big journey. Which then I guess brings us to the narrative itself, and the story here is actually really strong with some interesting twists and ideas to explore, even if some of the twists felt kinda predictable in my opinion, like the history of the Elda or some of the lore behind the humans. But being predictable isn't necessarily bad. I would much rather have a story filled with well-written predictable twists rather than a story filled with shocking unpredictable ones that don't really make sense. Some twists did definitely hit though. I did not expect Moore to be the king, and the moment when you realize why Will Metaphor is called Will was very satisfying, as everything kind of just fell into place. But some points of the narrative did leave me wanting a bit more. I was really interested in the old world, but outside of the Dragon Temple and the origins of the humans, it was all left very open, and I was kinda hoping to find out more. I was also really surprised to find out that the academy up in the Snowy Mountains wasn't more relevant. When I first looked at the map, I was expecting like a main dungeon or something in every single region, and then later you find out that there's this abandoned magic academy, and that got me really excited, because why wouldn't you go there and explore the ruins, find some lore? It felt very fitting, but there isn't really anything there outside of a boss. This kind of gave me cut content vibes, as there was so much stuff happening in the story back to back to back, and then Rella challenges you to a battle there. So I thought, oh, this is where they're gonna give me a 10-day deadline, I'm gonna get to explore the academy, I'm gonna get some more lore, some more information, and she's gonna be there waiting at the end. This could also give the fight some more build-up with Juna and all of that emotional baggage and stuff. But no, Rella shows her true motives, she challenges you, you go to the academy, you fight outside of the academy, she loses, she then reveals her actual true motives, and we move on to the next plot point. I liked these moments a lot, don't get me wrong, I adored this section of the game, but this is also right after the Louise assassination, and Dell's death, and Louise's return, and Forden's death, and it was just a lot in a very short amount of time, all while they were in an area that had the perfect setting for a dungeon. And I also had that feeling because the game doesn't really have that many main narrative dungeons, but I'm gonna touch on that later when I talk about the dungeons. Another thing that I was kind of surprised with narrative-wise then is that they didn't really go that far with the meta-narrative here. The game does have a narrator who addresses you in the beginning and in the end, but outside of that, Metaphor is basically completely contained within its own fiction. There's nothing wrong with that, but the game asking you to give in your IRL name, the book being based on our world, and all of that stuff, I kind of expected the ending to go absolutely insane with the meta elements, as they had so much potential to do that. The game is all about the strength of fiction, the connection between reality and fiction, and the game itself is a piece of fiction. The stage was set, I feel like they had everything to go absolutely insane with it, especially when Moore opened up the academia and we were in Shibuya. I was shook. Only for Moore to go, yeah, okay, this is an illusion and you proved yourself, your world is the real one, you can go back there now. If it sounds like I'm criticizing this moment, I'm absolutely not, by the way. That scene in Shibuya was impeccable and one of my favorite moments of this game. It integrated the themes of the narrative and the character arcs perfectly, all while giving us a satisfying answer to many of the game's greatest mysteries. I absolutely adored that scene. It's honestly perfect. So this segment of the video is in no way me criticizing a flaw of the game. I just wanted to mention it because this is an element or a direction that I had personally hoped and kind of expected to see explored, while the writers and the creators probably never even had the intention of doing that. I love my batshit insane fourth wall breaking twists, what can I say? The pacing, however, is a flaw. It was really solid for most of it, but near the end, it really fell off in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier with the Rela stuff, starting at a certain point in the game, every in-game day has a massive event happening back to back to back. But then later, there's also this massive section with zero plot progression. Judging by my save files, this section took me like 15 to 20 hours. So I don't really know why they didn't spread this content out a bit more. That way, some reveals could have had more build-up, they could have had more aftermath, kind of like basically every other arc in the game has. Which is then why, in my opinion, the game really drags near the end and why the pacing does stumble quite a bit. But while outside of that, the game has a very solid narrative, like the narrative in this game is really good, but it weirdly enough didn't have me hooked for the whole thing. I was always enjoying the story, but it was at the same time also lacking that something for a majority of it. I don't really know how to describe it, and I don't even know if that's a fault of the narrative, but I felt like mentioning it here made sense. It's just that feeling that you have when first playing one of your favorite games. That feeling of, I'm playing something special right now, and this experience is gonna stick with me. That spark. And while Metaphor had many great and memorable moments, it never quite reached that spark for me. Of course, I'm not just expecting any game to have that, but on paper, Metaphor had all of the elements that needed to create one. The way that the characters were handled, the way that the story was being told, how you explore this world, how you're on this journey, and how in many ways it feels like a classic JRPG. Sometimes you just can't put it into words, but it's like that feeling just hadn't hit yet. Until that is, we reach the end. It's just too bad that before we reached the end, I had to endure that final month, which I talked about earlier, which is where all of my gripes with the gameplay, and especially the pacing, really came into the forefront. This section really dragged for me, I mentioned it earlier, but 30 in-game days with no plot progression just completely killed all momentum for me. And it kinda just gave me that feeling that I don't really want to bother with it. I didn't feel like playing the game, while before I was playing it every single day. When I reached this part, I honestly just didn't touch the game for a week. And because of this feeling, I was also really scared to go back to the game and to do that ending. I was so out of it. Playing through that month kind of felt like a chore, especially because I already had every single bond and side quest completed with like 20 in-game days left. And my main reason for feeling this way was just the dungeon gameplay, because a lot of them are, let's be honest, they're pretty boring. There are some interesting ones, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them really do just drag on, especially the optional ones, which are tied to the bounties and the side quests. These really suffer from copy and pasted environments. These are supposed to be on completely different sides of the continent, but they're also complete reskins, which does kind of kill the fun in engaging with the side content, which is what you're gonna be spending a lot of time on in between the story events. And while the main dungeons are a lot better, they're also kind of hit and miss. You have the first dungeon, the Mausoleum, which is very basic, but that's fine, it's a first dungeon, it was fun. The second one was then a bit shorter with stealth sections, which was cool in my opinion, it changed things up. Then you have Louise's airship, which is basically a boss rush, which was also nice, it was again a nice change of pace. And then we go to the Dragon Temple, which is basic again, which is fine because we just had two gimmicky ones, but this dungeon is long. Really long. And after the Dragon Dungeon, for some reason we don't really have any main dungeons until I'm pretty sure we reach the final dungeon, which is then also, for some reason, really basic, and again, really long. I feel like these last two dungeons should have been a bit shorter with a unique one in between. If only there was like, I don't know, an abandoned magic academy in like I don't know, a unique environment like snowy mountains, which could be tied to a plot point that takes place in between these dungeons, maybe? That would be kinda cool. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up right now. The main dungeons definitely aren't terrible. They're pretty enjoyable, but I just wish they were a bit more engaging. And then we get to my next point, which is very much a personal thing, which also ties into the dungeon gameplay. Don't click off this video, I swear I have a reason for this, but I don't really vibe with the archetype system. Every single time I opened that menu, I just got very overwhelmed. What do I level first, and on which character? Which skills do I inherit? Which passives do I get? Why is this archetype locked behind this other one that I don't really want to invest into? Why is the final archetype for the main character all about physical damage when I want to use magic? I finally got a setup that works, but here comes a new character with a new job that I have to set up. I equip one job, but then I enter a dungeon and the game keeps giving me weapons for another one. All of the early party members lean towards physical builds, so I build my main character with magic, but I don't like the mage weapon. Am I playing this game wrong? I could go on, but I feel like you get the point. Those were just some of the things that were crossing my mind near constantly while playing the game. I'm aware that this sounds very dumb, and I was definitely overthinking it, but it was just kind of driving me insane to the point that my enjoyment actively plummeted once I opened that menu, or even once I unlocked a new party member or a new archetype. I did not set up Basilio at all. I love Basilio, he's one of my favorite characters in this game. I don't think I opened his archetype menu a single time because I was just thinking I cannot be bothered right now. I already have these other party members that I'm working on taking notes on, figuring out a setup. I can't do this for another one, not this late into the game. And I feel like part of the reason why it was such a big deal on me mentally is because Metaphor really requires you to dedicate. In games like SMT5 Vengeance, which I played earlier this year, you have a way to redistribute your level up stats. Maybe you start the game with a physical build, but then as you progress through the game you find a lot of magic skills that look really cool, and it just turns out that a magic build has more options that fit your preferred playstyle. So you just use this item and you have the option to redo all of your stats once or twice per playthrough. But Metaphor doesn't let you do that, and similarly you also can't reset the EXP that you put into the archetype trees. If you decide to level up an archetype, you are never getting that mag or that XP back, and this puts a lot of weight behind those decisions. And for me, who never ever played a game with a job system before, this was a bit much. It was only in the late game that I finally had a plan for how I wanted my party to be built. While I had some rough ideas and while I had some plans that would change very often, for the majority of my playtime a lot of XP was just wasted as I was testing out things or just going in a direction that ended up not being optimal for said character. And to recover from that, I had to do a lot of grinding in the final few hours. Thankfully though, there is the saving grace, which is the combat system, because the combat system is absolute peak. I loved the press turns, I loved the synergy skills and the added layer of strategy that brings with it, and the action combat was surprisingly fun, at least with some classes. Now that I mentioned peak though, the OST absolutely slaps, and while the game isn't very impressive on a technical level, the art style and the visual direction is so phenomenal that it makes this game look breathtaking at times. And at that point, it kind of doesn't matter that it's running on the Persona 5 engine, which is a PS3 engine by the way. And oh yeah, but the art and the UI is of course unmatched in the industry, but this is Atlus, so of course it is. Another thing that I do want to mention is that I kind of wish Metaphor had more new elements for a new IP. Don't get me wrong, this is not a Persona clone and this game does have its own identity, but so much of it is just a combination of already existing elements from Atlus. The popularity ranking, the calendar system, the social stats, the social links, the awakening scenes, a velvet room, the way that you interact with the dungeons, the way that you interact with the world map, I could probably go on. It definitely works here and it doesn't feel out of place. They even have some cool additions like the traveling taking up time. But for a new IP, I was hoping to see a bit more new, because I basically approach this game with the same mindset and with the same playstyle as I approach a Persona game, and I was able to do every single bit of content in a very efficient way, despite what the devs were saying pre-release, which also just wouldn't be possible with an SMT game or in Catherine, by the way. You approach those games very differently because they are very different games, which is why I'm surprised with how Persona-like Metaphor is. The only thing that I didn't do were the super bosses, but that was a personal choice as I couldn't really be bothered to grind even more, and I just wanted to finish the story at that point. I just can't help but wonder what this team could have done if they didn't structure it like a Persona game, if you get what I'm saying. But despite my gripes with the gameplay, at some point I did reach that final deadline, and thankfully the ending really pulled me back in. It had everything that it needed to bring me back, not only reminding me why I was enjoying the game up to this point, but going even further and having many of my favorite moments, and finally giving me that spark. Doing the final battle with Louise, having our friends fight the humans, the confrontation with Moore, the actual final boss, that boss team as well, and that epilogue. Everything about it was perfect. It pulled every single narrative thread together. It was thematically cohesive and it gave every character their moment to shine. It finally gave me that feeling that despite everything, this is truly a special experience. And while I can't really give it a perfect rating because of my personal gripes with the gameplay and the pacing, Metaphor is undoubtedly an experience that is gonna stick with me for a very long time. This video might look like a lot of negative criticism for me to still call this a special game, but that's just because the good aspects of this game are just that good. If I didn't care about the game, I wouldn't bother putting my energy into criticizing it like this. Despite my personal gripes with it, I acknowledge that those are very personal, and for some people that I know, like some of my friends, this is exactly what they want out of an RPG, and I can acknowledge that the systems here are genuinely incredibly solid, even if some of them just didn't do it for me. But even then, this game left a real impact on me. It told a very important message, and it wasn't afraid to let that message shine through in every single aspect, even down to anxiety being a status effect in the combat, or the lyrics of many tracks in the OST being written in Esperanto, a language for travelers made to connect people all over the world. Yes, that is how far the details go in this game. So despite its flaws, and despite the fact that I dislike the dungeons, despite the fact that I often couldn't be bothered to boot up the game knowing that I'd have to face the archetype menu, Metaphor is truly something special, and where many JRPG franchises today are shifting towards more action combat and realistic graphics, going further away from their roots with every entry, Metaphor is here to prove that classic stylized turn-based JRPGs still have a bright future. Thank you for watching. If you watched up to this point in the video, thank you so much, and if you want, let me know what you thought of it. This is something a tiny bit different for my channel. As I said, I literally just finished the game and wrote my thoughts down as a way to process them, and then I just randomly decided to turn that into a script for this video. So this video was kind of my thought process as I was coming fresh out of the credits. Now, because of all the end of the year content, this video was delayed from like early December to late January, but the goal with videos like this is to have more frequent uploads and to have these trying to process videos in between my bigger reviews, let's say. So let me know your thoughts. Do you like this idea? And if you do, make sure to leave a like and maybe share the video or subscribe to my channel. It genuinely really helps me out and it means a lot to me. And also, let me know what you think of Metaphor. Looking back at the footage while editing this video was honestly such a joy for me, because damn man, I have my issues with the gameplay, but I love this cast and this story so much. But yeah, I'm gonna end the video here. Thank you so much for watching, hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.